everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I am super excited to share with all of you a ranking of all 17 of my NATASHA DENONA palettes. So NATASHA DENONA is one of my overall favorite makeup brands. I would say she is second only to Pat McGrath, which is definitely my all-time favorite brand. And that's quite impressive given that Pat McGrath is a brand where so many of her products are my top favorites, whereas for NATASHA DENONA, she is mostly for me an eyeshadow brand. I do like her other products as well, but definitely her eyeshadows are where things shine. And so I am really excited to run through all these palettes with you guys today. So if you're interested in learning more about NATASHA DENONA eyeshadows, then just stick around. So let's start out with number 17 and 16 on this list. So these are actually palettes that you can't really pick up anymore. They weren't really products that were sold on NATASHA DENONA's website. So this one, the Jubilee palette, was one that I got in an Ipsy bag. So it was sort of a collab between NATASHA DENONA and Ipsy/BoxyCharm. So it wasn't sold on her normal website. And then this one over here is a mini of her retro palette. It's just a few of the shades from her Midi retro, and I got this from a Sephora favorites bag. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these, but just briefly mention that for this palette, it's actually really good quality, and I got some really nice looks out of this, but it's not really a color story that I really gravitate to a lot. For context, these sorts of Ipsy collabs usually are kind of a curation of shades from some of her discontinued palettes. So a lot of these shades are from the Tropic palette. And I actually have another one coming in the mail soon, her new Fez palette. And I find with these palettes, they're fun, they're good. You know, they have NATASHA DENONA quality for sure. But I think the reason she puts them in these sorts of collabs is it's color stories that are interesting, but not really ones that would be super marketable. So solid palette, just not really my favorite. And then in terms of this palette, I do really love the Midi retro and the actual mini retro, which I will talk about later in today's video. This is just a cute little baby retro that's nice for achieving a similar look to the Midi retro, but I find that this palette doesn't really give you a lot of depth because this shade over here is more of a mid-tone shade. So if either this were eliminated and there were a deeper shade, or this one were replaced by a deeper shade, I think this would have been perfect for travel, so you don't have to bring along an entire large palette like this. But as this curation stands, it's not really something I use very much. Next we have the Mini Love palette. So she also has a Midi Love palette, which I don't have, but I picked this up a few years ago when it launched during Valentine's Day. I'm not actually sure if you can still buy this palette. I'll have to check later on and put a little comment here. But kind of similar to what I said about the other palettes, this has a really nice formulation, definitely decent quality here, but it's just not my favorite color story. In general, as much as I do like pinks and purples, I feel like this sort of color story just comes across too Valentine's-y for me, so I find that I bring this palette out like once a year around Valentine's Day and do a look with it, but the rest of the year I'm not particularly interested in this color story. Also, in terms of quality, this shade is a little bit patchy, so it's not my favorite deepening shade to work with. But overall, a nice palette if you enjoy this kind of color story. Next, we have the Camel palette. And this might come as a surprise to some of you because I think this is a fairly popular palette. It is, as you can tell, a very neutral tone, and this is definitely a palette that she still sells. This was actually my first ever NATASHA DENONA palette. So when I was first getting into luxury makeup, I was watching a lot of Michelle Wong's videos, and this was a palette that she very consistently said was one of her favorites, and this color story, of course, is one that's quite everyday friendly. So I picked it up thinking that I would be able to use it all the time. But I think in part because of the formulations, but also just in part because of my skill level at the time, I didn't find it very easy to use these formulas. So these mattes over here are a little bit tricky to work with, especially if you don't have good natural hair brushes, which at the time I didn't. And then this shade here, which is the primary shade you would put kind of all over the lids for shimmer, is just a little bit deep, so it kind of blends in a lot with these mattes. You don't have that kind of lighter lid area contrast, which is personally what I prefer. Also, it's just not that high shine. And you have to understand, for this size of palette, I think it's around $50. So it's quite pricey per shade, and you really can't get a lot of versatility in terms of the looks. And for me, even though now with my current skill level and tools, I'm able to get a really nice look from this, I find that I can get a similar but nicer / easier to do look using either the Mini Nude or the bronze palettes. And so this is really not my favorite. And I think for me personally also, it actually initially turned me off from NATASHA DENONA because I bought this and didn't like it, couldn't really use it well, and assumed that I just didn't like NATASHA DENONA as a result. As I'll talk about later, another palette completely changed my mind about that. But as a result, this doesn't really have the best memories for me and is coming sort of towards the bottom of the list. Next we have the Mini Nude palette, and like I just said, this is a palette that I think gives you a very similar look to what you get with the Camel palette. They both have a really nice sort of everyday neutral tone to them. The Mini Nude is a little bit warmer, but I find the formulations in this palette to be more up my street. So these mattes are a little bit creamier and easier to blend. And then you have this really gorgeous shade here that's just very flaky and very high shine on the lids, but it's still really creamy, so it's really easy to apply, doesn't give you much fallout at all. And so I find this is a really beautiful curation to give you a complete everyday eyeshadow look in one very small travel-friendly package. Now, the reason this is coming a little bit low on this list is just because for me personally, this is a little bit warmer tone than what I go for nowadays for an everyday look. And so even though it's a really nice curation, I find that I don't actually use this much and don't really take it with me traveling. I think if the tones were just a smidgen less warm, then this would be absolutely perfect and I would be using this all the time. But just given my current tastes and color stories, this is not really a palette I gravitate to a lot. So moving right along, we have our first Midi palette, the Pastel palette. And this is actually a really fun palette. I got this when it came out last spring and really enjoyed playing around with it. At the time in particular, I was sort of in a pastel mood. I was buying pastels from indie brands and was really excited when this came out because I feel like if you have this palette, you really never need to buy any more pastel eyeshadows. This basically has you covered. And in particular, pastel shadows are actually really hard to formulate. They tend to be extremely chalky with the white base that they have in them. And so I was really excited with NATASHA DENONA coming out with this because she does have a relatively good pastel formula. I mean, if you're using pastels for the first time, you might not like this formula because it's not as good as her other mattes, but in the realm of pastel eyeshadows, this is actually a really good formulation. So I really don't have anything bad to say about this palette. Basically, it's coming where it is because I don't actually reach for this kind of color story that much anymore. And in particular, because this color story is so light, I don't really find I can create a full look out of it just because for my own personal preferences, I do like to have a bit of smoke in my eye look. Now, if you are going for more of that light look, I think this is great and has you fully covered. But just for myself, I don't actually reach for this that much anymore. Next up, we have Circo Loco. So I feel like this is a palette that people either love or hate. It's very polarizing because it's a very unique color story, let's just put it that way. It's extremely saturated and colorful, and it's a clown/circus themed color story, so understandably a lot of people have strong feelings about that. For me, I actually really enjoy this palette, but I almost never create looks using just this palette because by itself, I do find It's just a little bit too saturated and colorful for me. The looks are a little bit too clownish for my typical taste. But where this palette really shines for me is when I want to use a really colorful shimmer shade. So maybe like a multi-chrome shade or like a chameleon shade from Terra Moons, or some of my really flaky, beautiful shades from Adept Cosmetics or Cleona. That's when I usually reach for this palette, because if you use the mattes in this palette with a high impact shimmer that has sort of similar tones, then you can get actually a slightly more wearable look. Because for me at least, I do really like glittery shades that have some blue in them, some purple or some pink. And so I find if I sort of set up the look with these shades and then go in with that really high impact shade, it looks really good together. Also, for me, if I am doing more of like a pastel look, for example, and I want a deepening shade, this is my go-to. So for example, if I'm going to start out with some of the lighter shades, like these lighter kind of tealish greens, or these lighter blues, or these lighter pink or purple shades, then I'll use those as my transition and then go into this palette for the deeper shades. So this is really great for teal looks, purple looks, blue looks, pink looks. So that for me is how I enjoy using this palette. So it has an important role in my overall collection as a result, even if as a standalone palette I don't really use it for complete looks. Next we have the Retro Glam palette. So I really love the packaging for this palette, the shades, and also just this really fun swoosh, and the fact that it's a little bit raised is just so fun in my book. Now this color story is one that I sort of both love and hate, in that it's very unique, and especially the greens are shades I really enjoy. I do love this sort of sage green eyeshadow look. And so for that kind of look, this is the absolute perfect palette. And it is versatile in that you can make this kind of more appropriate in the cooler months because it is overall quite cool toned. But these sorts of sage, almost pastel-y seafoam greens also work really well in the springtime as well. So from that standpoint, I do appreciate this very unique color story. Now, what I don't like about this palette is I feel like, the whole point of this in theory is that you have this unique combination of green and red, and with these khakis to kind of tie things together. But every time I've tried to actually incorporate this red shimmer in any sort of look, I feel like it just kind of destroys the entire look. Like, I can incorporate these two as just sort of like faint transition shades, and then the rest of the look is green or khaki, and that looks pretty good. But if I really want to maximize the fact that this is a green-red palette, it just doesn't really work, which I mean makes sense from a color theory perspective. So if you look at the color wheel, green and red are on the opposite side, so trying to put them together in the same look is quite challenging. But that's the one thing I don't like about this palette, because if I'm using this palette, it's really as a khaki green color story, not really for the whole pinky green color story. And so I feel like this could have been slightly better curated, especially given how well curated the mini retro palette is, which is what this palette was inspired by, and which I will talk about shortly as well. The next palette is the Triochrome palette. So I actually really love this palette. Similar to Circo Loco, I feel like this palette is sort of a love-hate for a lot of people, because you basically just have these three shimmers down the center, and they're kind of lackluster. So when I first got this palette, I was super excited about these Triochrome shades, because at the time I was super into multi-chromes, and I was so excited that NATASHA DENONA was coming out with them. And this palette is quite pricey. It's like $130. And so I had high expectations for these three shades, and they turned out to be pretty lackluster. They really don't have a high shine value. As a side note, if you want to see swatches of this or any of the other palettes, I do have dedicated videos to almost all of them, so definitely check those out. But even though I was initially not super jazzed about this palette, I found that I really fell in love with it over time because of the matte shades. So where this really shines is these mattes are just so high quality and so beautiful and work in so many different looks. So if you are trying to do a look that is colorful but still slightly muted, this is the perfect palette. So it's kind of like the foil to Circo Loco. Circo Loco is super in your face, super saturated, whereas these tones are all a little bit muted and desaturated. There's a tiny bit of grayishness in these that make them slightly grungy and thus really approachable for a wide variety of looks. So I find for myself, whenever I want to do a green look, this whole row is beautiful. I usually don't really use the Triochrome shades. I'll go in with one of my indie shades or a shade from a different palette, but the look is just so impeccable. Similarly with this purple row, just so beautiful. Really hard to find these kinds of purple shades done so well. And then this last row I would say is slightly less unique, but this shade and this shade are just super beautiful. If you want that kind of pop of slight pastel, but still kind of muted and approachable. So I really enjoy this palette, and I would say especially if you can get it on sale, it's a really good deal. I bought this and Circo Loco in a bundle together for 40% off on Natasha Denona's website, and for me at that price it's definitely worth it. For full price, I think it just depends a little bit on how much you like that sort of more muted Triochrome effect, but on the whole a really lovely addition to my collection. Next up we have the Mini Retro palette. So this is a relatively new addition to my collection, despite the fact that this I think is her maybe overall best-selling mini palette, or at least one that I've heard the most positive things about. And so I had my eyes on this for a long time, but I didn't pick it up because I wasn't really sure what to make of this color story. Similar to Retro Glam, it's kind of unique in that you have pink and green together. And so I wasn't really sure how well those shades would play together. But since getting this palette, I've actually been very pleased with this. I understand what all the hype is about. So first off, the mattes are really creamy, really beautiful. They actually work quite well together because even though the palette kind of comes across as pink, if you look more closely, this shade is actually very much kind of a nude peachy shade. And so it doesn't contrast too much with the green shade. They actually play together quite nicely. And then these two shades over here are just really phenomenal. Very high shine, very creamy, very easy to use, but give a really high impact look with very little effort. This shade over here, I would say is fine. I don't really have very strong feelings about it, but overall the curation is really lovely. And I actually prefer this a lot to the Midi Retro because A, I think price-wise this makes a lot more sense, but B, this one I think coheres a lot more as a palette because the pinky shades have that sort of peachy, warm undertone to them, and that just blends a lot more easily into the greens in contrast to Retro Glam Midi, which is overall very cool toned, and so these cool toned pinks with these cool toned greens just really don't necessarily cohere that well. Also, the two high impact shimmers in this palette are just so much more high impact than any of the shades in this palette. Like basically Flutter is the only sparkly shade in this palette. The rest are kind of just more normal shimmers. And so I would definitely highly recommend this mini palette. Next we have the last mini in this roundup, which is the Mini Gold palette. So this is currently my favorite mini palette and also a relatively recent addition to my collection. I've been really enjoying green tones lately, and I feel like this is the perfect palette if you are looking for a green goldish look. It's pretty affordable as far as Natasha Denona goes, and the quality is just really impeccable. These two shades over here are perfect for setting up any look. This shade over here, even though it's a shimmer, is kind of a satin shimmer, and so it works really well as a deepening shade. This shade over here is really gorgeous, very high shine, really pulls together any look and gives it a lot of impact. And this one over here is really good for kind of blending this into the other shades. It has a dual chromatic effect, so it kind of goes from that grungy grayish green to the gold. And so I feel like this curation is just very well thought out, and all of these colors go super well together. And so if you're looking for a greenish gold palette, I think this is the most affordable and very high quality way to go. So for the final 6 palettes, I have to admit, these are very rough rankings. I think these would change a lot in rankings over time just because I love all of these palettes so much, and it really is a little bit more about color story at this point rather than quality or anything. So take these rankings with a grain of salt. I love all of these palettes a lot. So next up we have the bronze palette. So this is the perfect palette for summer. Really, really beautiful, warm, bronzy tones in this palette. I have so much fun whenever I play around with this palette because I feel like I'm guaranteed to have a look that's very easy to blend and put together, but still is really high impact. Now, I think the one critique that people tend to have about this palette is that it does tend to produce sort of similar looking looks. I mean, you know, all of these shades are very much bronze. But that said, at least for me, I feel like there's more versatility to this than might immediately come to mind, just because you do have these sorts of cooler tone, kind of grayish black tones over here, which allow you to cool down an otherwise very warm look. You also have like this kind of slightly brighter pinkish dual chrome shade, which can add a slightly different dimension as well. Also, these shades are all kind of similar, but it's still kind of fun to mix and match them, and they do differ a little bit in texture. So if you're someone who does enjoy bronze looks, I would highly recommend this palette, and I personally just find it so fun and satisfying to use. And now that we're in the final 6 as well, I should also mention that on my eyes today, I've used a variety of shades from these final 6 palettes. So from bronze, I used this rhodium shade in the outer corners. So if you see a little bit of kind of hint of purplish gray there, that's from this rhodium shade. And then I also used a little bit of alloy in the inner corner, so any oranginess there is coming from this shade. And as always, the rest of the products on my face will be linked down below. I tried to do as much of a full face of Natasha Denona as possible, so I have her concealer, her blush, her highlighter, and her lip liner on today. Next, we have the newest addition to my collection, which is the Glam palette. Yes, I am very, very late to this wagon. This is, for many people, their favorite Natasha Denona palette. For me, it took me a while to get this just because I'm actually normally not that big a fan of sort of grayish, cool-toned eyeshadows. It's sort of taken me a while to come around to this because my skin tone is a little bit more on the yellow peachy side, and so for a long time I preferred shades like those in bronze that have that warmth to them. But recently I have been getting much more into cool tones, and so that's why I finally decided to pick this up, and I've been really, really enjoying it ever since then. I find that this is just like the perfect everyday palette if you're someone who likes cool tones. It's very easy to use. I was kind of skeptical about like the labels initially because that was quite controversial when this palette came out, because obviously these labels don't really make sense depending on your skin tone. I think this sort of makes sense for my light medium complexion, but if you have a deeper complexion or a much lighter complexion, these labels might not work for you. And she does have on her website sort of ways you can rearrange the palette depending on your skin tone. But at least for me, I was kind of surprised how well this worked for me in terms of just following what it says. And so it kind of takes the guesswork out of putting together a really nice look. And I find that even though similar to bronze, it's quite monochromatic, there still is versatility in terms of the types of looks you can achieve. So for example, there are these really cool kind of grayish tones here, but then you have some slightly warmer / more neutral mattes like this blend shade over here. Similarly with the shimmers, you have a lot of sort of grayish toned ones, but also some of these warmer ones and some pinkier ones. And so it really has you covered in terms of a wide variety of looks. Now there's no really high impact shimmers in this palette, unlike the rest of these palettes in the top 6, but it's just so nice for an everyday look. So that's why it's ranking where it is, even though it took me a very long time to get on board with picking this up. So the next palette is the Retro palette, the Midi Retro palette. And I really love this palette. So this is kind of more of a mauvey, still overall cool toned, but cool tone leaning to neutral palette. And this is the absolute perfect palette if you like those sorts of burgundy kind of vampy looks, which I personally do. So I've really enjoyed every look that I've gotten from this palette. I find that the quality of the shadows is really impeccable. And it has a decent amount of versatility as well. So if you stick to kind of this side of the palette, you have a lot more of those peachy tones. So it's going to be a little bit more neutral / slightly warm. Versus this side is going to give you much more of that kind of cooler, vampier look with slight purple hints as well. I really love this shade Jude over here. It's just such a high impact shade that really ties together any look using this palette. And these little glitter topper shades are kind of fun as well. I wouldn't say they're my favorite. I still very much prefer my glitter toppers from Pat McGrath, but most of Natasha Denona's palettes do not actually include glitter toppers, so I do commend her for kind of experimenting with that because it gives you more options in terms of the textures in your look. That said, in terms of comparing these three palettes, I think they're all quite similar in that they sort of have a very monochromatic look overall, and they're all quite well suited for an everyday look. So I think it really just comes down to your personal preferences. Like, do you want something sort of warmer toned, in which case bronze is the best? If you like cooler toned looks, then do you like something that's a little bit more grayish brown, in which case glam is the best, versus something that's pinky mauvey purpley, which is what retro really excels at. But personally, I really enjoy all three. So we are in the final stretch, the last three palettes, and these were very, very hard to choose from. So in third place, we have the Metropolis palette. So this was actually the palette that made me fall in love with Natasha Denona. So as I was mentioning earlier, after I felt burned by the Camel palette, it took me a little while to come back around to buying anything from Natasha Denona because she is quite a pricey brand. And this is quite a pricey palette. I picked it up for around $130. But I really, really love the curation here. So for one, it's just so fun in terms of the number of shades you have. I really wish she did more palettes with this kind of format. So you have 28 shades, but they're not too big. She has her original really large 28 pan palettes, and I feel like those are kind of overkill for anyone who is not a professional makeup artist. These pan sizes are smaller, but it's more than enough for personal use. And with this number of shades, you can just get so many different looks. Like, you have this sort of everyday, more neutral row. You have these sorts of bluish tones, these really bright oranges and reds for more of a sunset effect. You have these beautiful greens and golds, these sorts of teal shades. So I find every time I open this palette, I'm really inspired because there's just so many different directions that you can go into. And supposedly with Natasha Denona palettes, they follow a grid system. So every quad, every column, every diagonal, so on and so forth, is supposed to make its own look. And I feel like with this palette in particular, you can have a lot of fun playing around with that concept because there's just so many different directions you can go into. Now, the only things I don't like about this palette are A, this is an older formulation from Natasha Denona. So some of these formulas I find don't work as well as her newer formulations. In particular, I think she's made a lot of progress in her cream to powder formula. Those are the mattes that feel slightly wet and creamy to touch and aren't kind of like a dry powder. So in this palette, for example, this shade over here, Lethal, is actually one of my favorite shades in the palette. I use it almost every time I open this palette just because I love that tone so much, especially if I'm doing this kind of greeny gold look. But this is in her cream to powder, and I find that sometimes it sort of balls up on the lids, / it does take longer to kind of blend out. So I'm not a huge fan of that. I wish that this was all in kind of her more updated formula. In addition, the palette does run pretty warm overall. So even though only like these shades look super orangey, the overall palette does have a slight orange vibe. So for example, this column, which looks neutral kind of next to the rest of the shades, is actually on the lids a bit more orangey than you'd expect. So if you don't really like orange, then I would say this palette might not work super well for you. But at least for me, it has a very special place in my heart in terms of making me fall in love with Natasha Denona and just really sparking my creativity whenever I open it. And I realized I kind of forgot to tell you about the rest of my eyeshadow look. So I have here the shade Orium on my inner thirds, and that's my favorite shade overall in this palette. I love how it has a little bit of goldish, greenish sparkle to it. It's very multi-dimensional, very, very fun. And then from the other palettes, from Retro, I used Amara as a crease shade today. So that's what's kind of blurring out that Rhodian shade. And then from the Glam palette, I have the Brow Bone shade on my brow bone and also the lash line shade kind of along my lash line for deepening. So now we're at number 2, which is the Glam Face Palette. It is definitely my most used Natasha Denona palette and one of my overall most used eyeshadow palettes. For me, this is just the perfect everyday color story. It's kind of like for some people what Pillow Talk is. It's just super flattering, super easy to use for every day. For me personally, Pillow Talk comes across way too peachy orangey on my lids. It does not come across as an everyday neutral palette, but this one over here is perfect. So today I have the shade Transition as my transition shade. For me, this is basically one of the most perfect transition shades. And I love using crease and smoke as well. It just does an impeccable job of setting up basically any everyday look. And then these 2 shades over here are in her Sparkling Metallic formula, which is one of my favorite formulas from her, because if I look at overall all of these palettes on my desk, one critique I have for most of them, especially compared to my Pat McGrath palettes, is that generally speaking, Natasha Denona does not have as many high impact shimmery shades. And she really turned that around though with this palette and these 2 over here, because these will give you really, really high impact, liquidy, shiny shades on the lids. And so it just makes it so easy to create any sort of look. I also love using this highlighter here as an eyeshadow. It's the perfect shade for the brow bone or inner corner. Or if you don't want such a high impact shimmer look, you can just use these mattes and just dab a little bit of this highlighter on top. And that makes it the perfect kind of office look as well. And so I bring this around with me a lot whenever I'm traveling because I feel like it's perfect for transitioning from day to night. And I have this in the light color story. There's also a deeper color story if either you have a deeper skin tone or you want something a bit more smoky. But in general, I just absolutely love this so much. I will say I don't actually use this blush pretty much ever. Like I think I used it once or twice when I first got it. So this review is purely about the powder shades. And honestly, I think it's quite impressive that despite the fact this thing takes up so much of the room in this palette, this is still overall my number 2 Natasha Denona palette. So in number 1 place, we have, surprise, surprise, the latest release from Natasha Denona, the Yucca palette. So I actually debated a lot about whether to put this in the number 1 spot because it seemed maybe a little bit premature because I got this palette maybe a month ago. It's her newest release. Like, is it really gonna stand the test of time? But ultimately, I had to be honest with myself, and I absolutely love this palette. So this is the first eyeshadow palette in general that I've seen in the past year, where the moment I saw the colors, I just knew I had to get it. I was so, so excited when I saw this. It's just something that really appeals to me on an aesthetic level. It's so beautiful, and I love how even though it has some of that monochromatic element in terms of overall being very much a khaki green color story, you still have those nice pops that make this much more interesting as a palette in comparison to some of her other palettes. So you have these beautiful peachy shades or this gorgeous tangerine shade. You have this more teal or forest green. You have this really cool silvery shade. And then what I really love as well is you have 3 of these shades here that are in her Sparkling Metallic formula, which I talked about with the previous palette. And like I said, it's my favorite shimmer formulation from her, so to have 3 in this palette is just really, really amazing. And I feel like this palette is kind of the perfect blend of the things I like in a lot of her other palettes. So on the one hand, you have the uniqueness of the color story. Like, sure, there's like other khaki green palettes on the market, but I still feel like this is a relatively unique curation. Similar to Metropolis, every time I open this, I feel like I can imagine new looks to create with it. At the same time, though, you can create something that's more monochromatic and very easygoing for an everyday basis. So I feel like it's just so versatile, either if you want to kind of spark some artistry or if you want to do something that's more straightforward and simple. For today's look, I have this shade Plantasia as the main shade in the center of my lids. I really love just how multi-dimensional this shade is. I also have the shade Ray under my lash line. It's the primary shimmer that I have over there. So overall, I've just been having so much fun with this palette. I feel like it's expanded my horizons. I've been loving using this Camu Camu shade in my inner corners. Usually I just go in with kind of a simple shimmer like I have today, but Camu Camu has really inspired me to explore matte inner corners as well, which is a lot of fun. Now, the only caveat I have about this palette is I have found that Fushi has gotten a tad bit hard pan, even though I haven't used it that much. Again, this is like some of the problems we have with her cream to powder formula being a little bit inconsistent. So that's the one thing I don't like about it, but at least for me at the moment, looking at my entire collection, I feel like despite that, this is still my #1 palette, and I am so glad that she released it this year. So that's the end to this very long rankings video. I hope this was helpful for any of you who are curious about NATASHA DENONA palettes and wanted to know my updated impressions about these palettes. I would love to hear in the comments which palettes you have enjoyed or maybe not enjoyed from NATASHA DENONA. There are still a few NATASHA DENONA palettes I don't have that I have been eyeing, and so would love to hear your thoughts about those as well. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!